uh, development needs that African countries are supposed to meet, right? We're talking about the SDGs, we're talking about the national development plans, and of course, the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. There is a lot that is supposed to be done in terms of these frameworks, and it goes with mobilizing resources at scale, which is what African countries are actually grappling with. And they haven't actually got to a point where they're able to meet those needs, but then we also have another layer of challenges, right, coming on to add to the existing challenges. And we're thinking of issues around the climate. You know, there have been several climate events. For instance, we have floods, droughts, you know, storms, and other climate-related shocks, you know, that affect African countries. And of course, some of these countries are those countries with the weak resilience, right? Which means they don't have that capability, you know, to be able to deal with these issues when they happen, right? And then some of them are actually very vulnerable. There's some political fragility, which is, you know, an issue in itself. And then we have issues of conflict. Recently, we have heard of a wave of, you know, unconstitutional takeover called the military coups that have been occurring recently in African countries from Guinea to Mali through Sudan, Burkina Faso, Chad, Niger, and recently, or just as yesterday, we have Gabon, a neighboring country to Cameroon, which is actually my home country. And unconstitutional takeovers comes with a lot of implications. We have issues around civic space, right? This has implication on the civic space. Or for you and me to be able to have that voice, to be able to advocate, you know, for the right policies when it comes to issues of debt governance, you know. There are implications there when this happens. Then there are issues around transparency and accountability as well. And then we have heard of, within the Sahel region, of the jihadist movements, especially in Libya, Mali affecting parts of Niger and Chad as well. And then we have internal conflicts going on. For instance, in the Eastern Congo, we have Cameroon and the Central African Republic. And then there's been the emergence of violent extremism, you know, community militia, you know, that has been involved, rebel movements, and even private, you know, mercenaries, you know, involved in the other many African countries, which, you know, keep, you know, creating, you know, instability in many African countries. And African governments are supposed to deal with those situations. And this has cross-border effects. Then recently, we heard of the health crisis, the COVID pandemic, the lockdown, and the slow economic activities that accompanied that, and the tightened fiscal space. We are just coming out of that, and countries are still actually dealing with the effects, you know, the spillovers of the health crisis. Then we have geopolitical tensions, like in Eastern Europe, which also have spillover effects that have affected African countries. And just to indicate that many African countries, for instance, depend on their grains, you know, imported from this region, from Eastern Europe. And this has implications in terms of food sufficiency, food security for many African countries. Then there are limited economic opportunities as well. You know, 34% of African countries, of African youths are unemployed, especially those between 15 to 24 years of old. And adding to this is the migrant crisis. We have heard of so many African youths, you know, struggling to cross the Mediterranean, you know, to reach mainland Europe, right? And those who have also followed, who try to go to the United States, we say it in my country, going to the United States by foot, maybe following some channel through Mexico, right? We have heard of those. And I think these are part of those crises. And in between that, we have African countries that do not actually have that voice or that representation in global decision-making places to be able to bring about the change that creates that enabling environment for them, not only to mobilize the finances, but to also influence the international financial architecture in a way that also gives African countries, enough space to be able to mobilize the financial resources that they need to cope with this crisis. So this puts together a challenging picture in the midst of the public debt crisis, in the midst of current debt burdens that are faced by African countries. And when you look at the fiscal space, you find that African countries, they are just able to mobilize about 18% in terms of domestic resource mobilization, to be able to meet their development financing needs. That's about 80% of that, which means the rest of it comes from other sources, includes borrowing, and including borrowing. And this has huge investment implications on the SDGs, infrastructure development, and of course, social programs. Then, when you look at it, there is a very widening gap, between the revenue mobilization potential and the borrowing, right? For instance, roughly we checked, and then we see that what we call the general gross government debt, which reflects the full extent of liabilities for African governments to be debt-free, which between 2022 and 2023 stands at 1.5 trillion, compared to revenue, right, which is just about slightly over 500 billion. Then you see that gap that African countries are faced with. And who are the most indebted? Of course, the most indebted are the biggest economies. Egypt, South Africa, and Nigeria, they hold about 50% of this debt. But I think this picture is also deceptive, because some of the countries, because they hold less, does not mean their debt burden is any manageable, right? So we need to know that despite the fact that a good chunk of the debt is held by the biggest African economies, does not mean that the other African countries have debt burdens that are manageable. And a good part of this debt remains with China, and top Chinese borrowers being Angola and Kenya. And of course, there is a reason for this, the infrastructure initiatives such as the Belt and the Roads Initiative, where China has recently put about 156 billion, in 35 African countries, targeting mainly energy, construction, logistics, telecoms, and of course, military projects. And in terms of the debt risk, recently, the four most indebted, or the four countries in debt distress, there were 8 altogether, and 4 of them within the SADC. We have Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Mozambique. Then within the Central Africa, we have the Republic of Congo. And in East Africa, we have Sudan and Somalia. And when you look into these countries, you see that these are, of course, those countries that I said are the least resilient when it comes to dealing with shocks. And of course, many other countries above this are in high level of debt distress: Cameroon, Ghana, Chad, Central African Republic, Mauritania, Angola, Kenya, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and you can name a lot of them who are in high risk of debt distress. Of course, this is according to recent IMF assessments, debt sustainability assessments. And of course, this is as a result of increased borrowing. And when you look at issues in relation to the debt ratios, you see that most African countries have recently moved up their debt ceilings, which means issues around regional convergence, like, for instance, 60% debt to GDP ratio within SADC, ECOWAS, and CEMAC. Many countries have actually moved past this level, and 50% for IAC, and of course, many countries have just breached that convergence criteria. Okay, 2 minutes. Janai says 2 minutes. Maybe I won't go back to these figures, but what I'll actually I won't go for the recommendations. Rather, I will allow the recommendations to be part of the discussion in terms of exploring this subject, not being prescriptive. I think for a long time, we have been very prescriptive in terms of saying, okay, if we do 1 + 1, we will get 2, right? But I think this is a problem that needs more dissection. And I think I'll allow that to the discussions rather than actually coming up with or giving to you a list of recommendations of what is supposed to be done. But most importantly, I think there are structural issues that we must admit, taking from the discussions that we had yesterday, in terms of the structural issues, in terms of issues around reforming the global financial architecture, but we cannot also do that if we don't start mobilizing as civil society, right, and as governments to be able to have a reformed international financial architecture. So there is a lot that is supposed to go into that, which I think I will leave it to the discussions rather than trying to maybe being prescriptive here, which I think is not also enough, for us to live here with a more enriched perspective on how we need to deal with the current debt crisis facing African continent. Facing the African continent. So I will leave it at that, Chennai, and I hope I did justice with the 2 minutes that were left. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Theo. Can I actually, no, you can join us.
Okay.
And this will give you an opportunity to share with us your recommendations.
Okay.
Apologies for the time, but we have an hour and a half in which to unpack all of this. And I'm really, really keen to get the panelists to contribute to the conversation. But I think, thank you for painting the context. I think you really unpacked this poly-crisis situation, right, that you referred to. Speaking to climate change, speaking to the conflicts that we're seeing both within the continent and outside the continent, and what that means for us, for our food security, for example, and really just helping us see the fact that this current debt situation that we are discussing is happening within the context of so many other issues that have implications in terms of how we talk about debt, as well as how we can start to look at addressing this particular problem. So to help us narrow down this conversation, I'm now going to invite Honorable Piri, who is from the National Assembly in Zambia. And I think, Honorable Piri, I'm really excited to hear your perspectives to this conversation, because Zambia really is an important country within this conversation, right? When you think about where it's come from and the deal that His Excellency Hakainde Hichilema was able to strike as far as restructuring was concerned. But the question that I have for you is twofold. At present, we have over 20 countries that have a debt to GDP ratio of over 60%. What are the implications specific to the Zambia context that you've seen as far as financing for key social sectors, health, education, as well as, for example, key sanitation services? And then secondly, as a member of parliament, how has the legislature played a role in starting to tackle this situation? So just because the time is tight, I've been told by the moderators to give you 5 minutes, but we will definitely come back to you because we will have a second round of questions. So over to you, Honorable.
Thank you so much, Madam Moderator, and thank you for everyone who is present in this conference. My name is Chrysostom, as is Honorable, at Halwindi Piri, Member of Parliament, in the National Assembly of Zambia, specific in a constituency called Kabwe Central Constituency. So coming to zero into the question that we have asked, indeed, I want to recommend our President and his cabinet for striking a deal in restructuring the debt. Nevertheless, that is not enough because the debt still remains the debt. I want to zero into the question to say that the higher the debt to the GDP ratio, the less likely the country can manage to pay the debt. However, whether the country in that situation, it has to pay the debt. And in that situation, indeed, we have seen that, like in the scenario of Zambia, previously, the education, health, and the social welfare sector suffered a lot because most of the resources were going to servicing the debts. And of course, not forgetting that their emoluments, their wages, and also we need resources to run the country. So in any country which fails, to offer health services, quality education, it's heading to even further decline in terms of economic social development. Because we all know that, of course, a health nation is a wealth nation. We all learned during the COVID-19, when we were hit so badly, if the health services are not up to date, the economy can badly be affected. And also, if as a government you cannot invest more in education, we will see a lot of youth that will be on the street, uneducated youth, and we know that education is the greatest equalizer if we don't invest in education. So looking at the outlook of what we had, indeed it was very difficult to invest in social services, and we saw a lot of projects, for example, in Zambia, that were started but were never completed. This also meant that even what was done, we saw a lot of destruction, vandalism, that even the little money that were invested, it went to waste. So it's very important that indeed as we contract the debt and as we allocate money even to projects, we know that we have enough money to complete a project. So that is the outlook for Zambia. Really, education suffered, but alas, after debt restructuring, we saw that a lot of money from central government were allocated to constituencies through CDF, that is Constituent Development Fund, and the priority sector was health, education, which now we're saying Zambia has made a mark, that we have seen a lot of construction of clinics, schools, provision of desks, and schools that are given, they are receiving a lot of grants to support the education sector. It's because of the breathing space that we have been given. So in a country where the debt is at least minimal, you can see that these services can easily be provided. So that's what I can say on your first question. Now, as a member of parliament, first I want to say that parliament is a very important institution, one of the drivers to democracy. And any country, before it contracts this debt, parliamentarians are mandated by the Constitution to make sure that they approve the debt. But that is not enough. Also, how do we make sure we approve these dates? We have to make sure that as parliamentarians, we have to interrogate the executive to find out what is the date meant for. How is it going to impact the development of the country? How is the country going to pay back? What period, what investments are going to put in the resources they are borrowing for? This is what is important as parliamentarians. We need to make sure that we go to interrogate. But you find that in most cases, when a budget is brought or maybe a public contract date is brought to Parliament, they read through, and then one or two people debates, and there you are, you pass the date, which is not the right way to do it. We need to rethink and reorganize ourselves as parliamentarians so that we do a serious interrogation to the executive, so that when we are contracted date, we know for sure that there is need and the country is. So, and also, parliamentarians now have come to this point of saying we play an important role. As I said earlier on, that we is really what I'll say it's very important in terms of upholding a democracy. Most of the times, what we say makes the work of Parliament not to be effective is because of we talk on the political lines. So decisions that we make sometimes are not very good to development because you want to talk the direction of what the executive want, what your political party wants. So it's high time that as parliamentarians we become apolitical, that when we are making a decision, it's with the good of the country and for the good of the development. So I want also to say that in the southern region, it's high time that as parliamentarians we unite, we work together and make sure that our countries are protected by making sure that whatever decision we make is a decision that is going to see development to our country. Also, in conclusion, I want to say that the other challenge we want to pose to civil society and the people around here is to make sure that our leaders, we have to make sure that they hold accountable of what they are doing. I want to say that in most of the borrowings that we see around these countries, sometimes they are political motivated. One leader maybe just want to make a political marriage to borrow. Subsidies, just because you want to get a name that you are helping the people. Instead of borrowing to invest, for example, in agriculture, you want to put in subsidy fuel or in maybe building, which is not. So let us make sure that our borrowing that we make, they are inclined to political economy, unlike to just a political political gain to certain individuals or to political leaders. So this is what has destroyed, that has made our countries to be in big problems. Because if, for example, Zambia, if we had borrowed $12.5 billion, where did it go? If you look at the services, health, education, they really suffered during that time. That means the money somehow was mismanaged. Finally, as parliamentarians, the role of oversight is very important for us. Even when we contracted a date, we allow it. Do we really make sure that, we make follow-ups, we offer oversight, so that in case there is anything that have gone not according to the planned or intended goals, we should be quick to raise the red flag, so that, no, this is not what was intended, in the first when the agreement was contracted. By that, we'll make sure that whatever funds a date is contracted is put to good use, unlike that the money goes to things that have been put on the table. So, Alois, thank you so much. We're looking forward to hear from people as they ask you questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Honorable. I think, even as you were speaking, the Zambia situation is not just unique to Zambia, and I think it is a situation that many African countries find themselves. I was reading that last year African countries, the continent as a whole, paid more in terms of debt repayments than they invested within the health sector, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think we can start to see across the board the way in which debt is having implications on key social sectors that are needed for us to really achieve our developmental objectives. James, I'm going to come to you now. So I think for you, I have a question that's much more specific to the East African community. So generally, we have seen African governments accumulate substantial domestic as well as external debt, right? And this was the case even before COVID-19. So as we've been doing this, one of the things that has come to the fore is that perhaps it's a question of fiscal indiscipline or a lack of strategic priority. Would you say that this is indeed the case, right? That's the first part of my question. And then the second part is, within the EAC, there's a debt to GDP criterion, right? Which stipulates that it should be less than 50%. However, almost all EAC countries themselves have violated this criterion. What do you think is the best solution to this problem? Do you think it's as a result of perhaps weak legislative oversight? So I know this is a very loaded question, but I think really keen to hear some of your perspectives with regards to the way in which the East African region is tackling the debt situation.
Thank you, Shania. Let me pick up from that perspective of fiscal indiscipline or, strategic priority measures. I first of all don't think there is nothing like strategic priority measure, because everything that's required by government to be done is important. It's just a question of prioritization. So there's nothing strategic about it, because then the military will come before the health services, and we've seen where resources have been directed. Now, if you look at the spending, the spending before COVID on debt payments, and even now, and take the case for Kenya, our debt repayment, both principal and interest, is around $9 billion. But our investment, both at the national level and county level for the health and agriculture services, is just around $4 billion. So is then that, what's the priority? We've already contracted the debt, and so it has to be paid, because in our constitution, it's the first charge on our revenues. So when I think about then how that plays out, then the question that we have to ask around fiscal indiscipline is, to what extent does budgeted corruption play into the conversation? Because that's still one of the major questions that have not been answered with regards to fiscal indiscipline. Fiscal indiscipline and budgeted corruption is a question of lack of discipline. And that has to be tackled towards getting us out of that. So prioritization of funding, we've got to ask also, how debt is contracted. What's the capacity of our government officers to negotiate the terms that are contained there in the loan agreements? And we know fiscal indiscipline ultimately would lead to fiscal consolidation that would mean, to a greater extent, denial of critical services to citizens. Now, all these conversations around contracting, fiscal discipline, and prioritization have to be confronted at each particular stage that we see debt contracting happening. And of course, draws difficult questions at which either civil society, policymakers, the executive arm have to engage in those areas. It's also essential to consider the context, including structural fiscal deficits. Some of these have come a long way, they are legacy debts. And these legacy debts that have led us to where they are, some of them we cannot even tell whether they are actual debts or not. So we have to keep asking ourselves, really, then how do we address, and are there consequences? Well, we might identify and say it is a question of fiscal discipline, but are there consequences when we identify this? So we've got to be able to respond to that. With regards to EAC debt to GDP criteria and convergence, well, we've breached, and I think the question we have to ask is, what's the essence of a law if we cannot respect it? There are quite a number of convergence criteria within EAC, including the deficit, the 3% convergent criteria. But So then we need to ask ourselves, what are these things that we need to do to address this effectively? And one question that, as at the institute that we are looking at currently is the question of unrealistic revenue targets. And unrealistic revenue targets across the ESC is something that's it's so obvious. And so part of it over the years have been to be able to allow governments to borrow. So, and this borrowing would ultimately come through supplementary budgets, because the scrutiny by legislative organs, which is parliaments for this, in East Africa is a little bit intense during the formulation of the budget. But during implementation, it goes down. And this has been corroborated by the Open Budget Survey. So within that window of the budget's implementation, then we have been able to see executive introduce supplementary budgets. And supplementary budgets, what they do is that they bring down the revenue targets, domestic revenue targets, and increase the borrowing element of it. So that one has to be something that we need to confront. And of course, then those fiscal deficits, we have got to ask what leads to them. The other question that needs to do is we need to strengthen our tax administration. I know there's a lot of work going, through ATAF, through OECD support, TJNA, the work that you're doing supporting the tax administration. But still there's a lot of work that needs to go within ESC towards strengthening the tax administration. And of course, at this particular point, our borrowing, generally, even as Africa, from international financial system, it's still not to our advantage. It's still, it's very punitive to borrow. So I think when you're in a crisis, sometimes it becomes easier because you're the one who needs to demand for some specific reforms. So we know what's happening, and I think that's it. And comprehensive budgets, that, when we look at the program-based budgets, what exactly are these targets that we are putting for financing within the budgets? Thank you very much.
Hello? Never mind, it's good. Thank you so much, James. And I think your points are actually a really good segue into the question that I have for Honorable Osei, who's from the National Assembly of Zambia. So Honorable, one of the points that James, National Assembly of Ghana, apologies. Honorable, one of the points that James mentioned is that there is also a conversation we need to have about revenue mobilization, right? So as a continent, Africa has a tax to GDP ratio of 18%, and this is the lowest of any region in the world, right? And so tax, however, despite this, is looked at as one of the ways in which we need to start addressing our current debt situation. So, Honorable, the question for you is, even as we have this conversation, there are citizens that are concerned that as we're talking about tax, it essentially means an increased burden on them. How would you respond to that question, right, when we're talking about revenue mobilization and the implications that it has on citizens? And then my next question to you is, as a legislator, what do you believe parliaments, both those at national and regional level, should play to limit the negative effects of increased debt, particularly within countries that have a low revenue mobilization? Over to you, Honorable.
Thank you very much. Colleague, panelists, friends from across Africa, our sponsors, I thank everyone for this opportunity. The way I see Africa, I think I have it differently. I see sub-Saharan Africa as being suffocated by our own deeds, mostly. Because although all of us are not endowed naturally equally, some are well positioned to be able to take care of themselves. but we still find ourselves in this doldrum. Now to the question you asked. Revenue mobilization, as you said, in Africa's perspective, we look at it from taxes. But as I said earlier, some countries have other ways of making some money. If I take Ghana, for instance, we are endowed with a lot of natural resources, gold, diamond, timber, cocoa. Now we have iron ore deposits, petroleum, and a lot more. We have even found lithium in large quantities that we are preparing to. But one may ask, why do we see ourselves in this difficulty? Let me take you through some points that I've enumerated here. We all know improved domestic resource mobilization is a critical enabler to Africa's development. We need to ensure stringent measures to mitigate corruption, which has been identified as one key problem for African countries. We can only do this through transparent governance and strong legal frameworks. The UNCTAD estimates that about $88.6 billion are lost through illicit financial flows annually. Is there anything that we can do about this? We still allow ourselves to be cheated along these lines. And then we put all the pressure on the poor African through taxes. You know, our economies depend heavily on VAT, and that comes with a huge chunk of money for a revenue that we look up to. So formulating enhanced policies governing this particular tax will also get us something in terms of revenue to support our well-being. You also have to formulate and implement robust tax collection administration to avoid tax evasion. We need to reform to broaden the tax base. In this instance, Ghana, for instance, has decided to take away all subsidies on agric inputs. And we have also taken away exemptions on importation of these inputs. We have also amended the Exemption Act to take away all the rights that government agencies had in clearing their goods and other things on exemption. So we will have to apply to the government through the finance minister to Parliament for approval before, if there need be, you are granted exemption to do anything. So therefore, we are mobilizing some monies, that's revenue, through these activities. We also have identified property tax. Ghana, those of us who know Ghana, looks quite beautiful. We have magnificent buildings and all that. But prior to this time that we have these economic difficulties, property taxes were not being collected effectively. But now, through advancement of technology, we have been able to number and label all properties in Ghana that we take the taxes from them. That is the property rate. We have been able to implement a tax identification system that links with passports, driver's licenses, births and deaths registry, and all other government agencies that need data, including the mobile phones. Your number will reflect your TIN. So right from the word go, at the first weighing of the child, you are given a number that will follow you throughout your life. So Ghana is advancing on that front. And I believe when that is done perfectly, we can mobilize a lot through taxes. We also file our taxes at home, online. You go to Ghana.gov, and the interface is open for you to do whatever you want to do with that. You also need to ensure efficiency in revenue collection, and like what I said, we are on top of those issues.
Okay.
We also have to improve in governance and spending, because if the people lose trust in paying taxes, they'd find ways and means to evade. And when they see that governance is transparent and the parliamentarians are holding executive to its feet, I think the morale for payment of taxes will be boosted, so nobody evades tax, and that will go to increase the revenue that we mobilize locally. I come to the second portion of it.
2 minutes.
Okay. You know, Parliament, most of us here, I know some here are parliamentarians. We have this role of oversight, and that is what we need to play seriously, because in some jurisdictions, Ghana, for instance, we are practicing the hybrid, the US system and the UK system together. So we find it difficult in Parliament to check the executive. The executive is supposed by law to nominate or to appoint not less than 50% of the ministers from Parliament. And when it happens this way, it becomes very difficult to challenge the executive. That is where we have our difficulty. But even in the midst of this difficulty, we still have controls that we take them through. So we have to support advocacy. We do advocate for legislation that seeks to improve institutional framework for debt management. Recently, Ghana enacted a law that was the Public Financial Management Act 2016. And the Financial Management Act established the Fiscal Responsibility Council, and in 2018, we also had the Fiscal Responsibility Act 982, which monitors compliance with the fiscal rules. And with this, the Minister of Finance has to come to Parliament at any given time that he wants to exceed the limit set to seek express approval before those things are done.
Honorable, if you
Yes.
could do your last point.
Yes, the last point is on the measures that we've taken to improve upon the well-being of the vulnerable in society. I think this is very, very important. We have expanded the Social Protection Initiative. We have Living Empowerment Against Poverty, LEAP, that gives a stipulated amount of money quarterly to poor households. We have also implemented free school feeding program for the basic school. We have AfCODD, free compulsory basic education for everybody in the country. So we have decided to increase enrollment through provision of food for all the pupils that are at the basic level. We also implement free senior high school, where students at the secondary school, the high school, are not paying anything. We even give the school uniforms to them that they can also access education. We have allowances for teacher trainees and the nursing trainees. They take allowances throughout their 3-year training program. And I'm very happy that even though we're going through this difficulty, we all know the distress that we find ourselves in, these particular safety nets are still maintained, and it's helping a lot. We have a national health insurance policy that covers everybody in the country. So I believe Ghana, we are doing, but I don't know when this is implemented widely across Africa, we can share some of the best practices to help our neighbors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable. It's really great to hear, I think, some of the measures and the steps that you're taking within Ghana. And as you've mentioned, some of them can be considered best practices. Lavu Piri from the National Democratic Institute. So my question to you is to help us nuance the conversation a little bit, right? At the end of the day, when we are talking about the impact of debt repayments, right, and even the impact of increased domestic resource mobilization, it doesn't treat everybody the same. And so my question to you specifically is, how do debt service conditions harm particularly women within Africa? If you could help us probe into that question.
Thank you very much, Chanai. So I'll go straight into discussing the crowding effect of debt servicing. So with this country struggling with debt, the debt service itself becomes a constraint on national budgets. And added to that, Honorable mentioned the wage bills that go towards civil service. At some point in Zambia, close to 50% was for wage bills specifically, and about 30 or more towards debt servicing, which left very little funds to do anything else with. And so with that, we noticed a trend where while debt servicing increased steadily, financing or funding for education, health sector, social services, sanitation started also to decline steadily. Now, the effect to women is that, first of all, programs to do with health will affect the procurement of drugs in hospitals. It will affect the staffing levels. The doctor or nurse to patient ratios rise uncontrollably. And then also we have programs that have to do with gender-based violence, reporting and programming, as well as sexual reproductive health services start declining. And so women fail to access these services, end up getting sick, start losing incomes because they are spending more time at home or at private hospitals. So that's part of the first prong of the problem on the social services. But also, tight fiscal space also leads to shrinking economies and retrenchments, redundancies, and so on and so forth. Again, it's the women that are first to be let go. They are the first victims when it comes to losing job or reducing labor forces, whether in the private or public sectors. And with that, they lose out on incomes or entrepreneurial opportunities that they would get. Some of the conditionalities for this debt include job freezes, wage freezes, and redundancies. Again, it's the women's opportunities in the labor market that suffer first. They do not have as much opportunities as compared to men. And with this inequality, economic inequality, actually comes gender inequality, in the sense that women are now paid less for the same job that the men do, and that also affects the economic potential for women. Now, as the social system collapses, you find that in society, again, it is the women who are readily, available to leave a paying job to go and take care of their sick relatives, whether it's a husband, a child, elderly parents, or siblings, and so on and so forth. They will give up their job. The man will still continue working, but the woman will be, the one to leave a paying job in order to take care of these social services that government is slowly, failing to provide. Also, the tightening fiscal space forces countries to look for, revenues everywhere. The government starts looking at broadening the tax base, as Honorable just said. And this leads to governments looking for taxes to increase. And one of them is the regressive taxes, such as the value-added tax. Now, the value-added tax increases the cost of, if it's essential commodities like food itself. This weakens the women's buying power because, again, it's the women who are more readily going to buy food for the house. The women will make sure, are the ones who will make sure that there's food, there's provisions in the house, and through the VAT, their economic empowerment possibilities are reduced. So basically, those are some of the issues that relate to the tightening fiscal space as a result of debt service. But also, you find that at household level, when there's no money in the household, it is the girl child who will be pulled out of school first. The boy will continue going to school. So all those have potential to limit the empowerment, prospects of women. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Lovewood. I think thanks so much for showing us. Yes, we can give him a round of applause. The differentiated impact, right, that the current debt crisis has. And so now going to our last panelist, Ms. Lee Everts from UNECA, almost tying us back to where the conversation spent quite a lot of time yesterday, which is the international financial architecture. My question for you is, do you believe that reforming the international financial architecture is an important measure that we need to look at to address the structural problem that sits at the heart of this indebtedness situation that we're currently discussing today? Over to you, Lee.
Thank you so much, Janai. So if we look back, the global financial architecture was crafted about 3/4 of a century ago, 78 years ago, and it was done for the post-war world. And if you think about it, nothing about climate, about gender, about inequality issues at that point was deemed as important, right? So what does that mean? This world has completely changed. And so this current architecture is basically at odds with the world today. In 2008, when we had the global financial crisis, the GFC, there was a few small changes made, but it really didn't change anything. And also because some of our economies didn't really feel that massive impact that some of the developed economies did. But we are seeing, because we are more integrated, 13 or 15 years later, we are more integrated. We are definitely feeling everything that's happening in the world. And this existing architecture, basically, it's not geared towards long-term revenue mobilization or to achieve and finance our SDGs, Sustainable Development, SDGs. So if you go back and think about what the GFA really is, it's sort of a governance type of arrangement that safeguards stability and the functioning of the global monetary and financial system. But who's included in that system, right? So included in that system is norm setters. It's not rule makers, it's norm setters, but we follow those norms. The IMF, the World Bank, private sector finance. Then you have sort of influential groupings like the G7, the G20, OECD, and tax matters, credit rating agencies, and then you have the UN as implementers. I didn't hear any of our names in that list. None of us are there. Maybe the UN as the implementer, I'm from the UN, but really.
Lee, could you bring your mic a bit closer to you?
Sorry, thank you. So it includes part of, I know, when you read through all these things that these guys bring out, these policies, recommendations, steps, procedures, whatever, you will see that some of the Addis Ababa action agenda is included, but that's more on technical support. It's not really on how Africa is part of all of this. So basically this thing has remained unchanged. And I can tell you now, if you've done your homework, if you read what we said in the 1980s and what we're saying now is almost exactly the same. minor tweaks here and there. And this is why I actually liked Prof's lecture yesterday. He was speaking about looking at history, but also looking forward. And I find that we find ourselves, and this is my personal view, sort of stuck in retrospectively what happened, right? I feel we're not looking forward to say, when is the next shock coming? How do we plan for that? How do we gear up for that? What are we supposed to do? It's a bit worrying, and I know there's a lot of young people around the table, and I'd like to know what they think, what the future problems are going to be, because what we're doing now is trying to solve what's currently there and what was historically there, but there are more to come, and I think we are a little bit stuck at this point. That's one of the points I wanted to make. So the other one is, I mean, I've given you the list now, so it basically shows us that there's not a lot of power that we have, and in terms of voting power, we have nothing. And so, Patrick, I'm going to take you back to the point yesterday that you said we mustn't beg to be at the table of the G20. And when President Mackie brought the proposal, the Americans and France said, guys, come, please come. And some of the other countries, it's only the EU that has not come to the party. And I think we've deserved that space. We've basically been the backbone of industrialization in all of those countries sitting on the G20, so we deserve that space. Again, what I think we're not looking at is, you know, what is it that's preventing us from being there? And I think you made that point yesterday. And if we were there, if we were at the table, what are we talking about? What are we bringing to the table? Are we talking about, again, our historical things? Or are we forward-thinking, saying, how do we put Africa on the map? How do we build our continent? So just maybe on some of the specific issues on the global financial architecture, you know, we have higher borrowing costs than any other region. Just take normal private capital markets. Africans are paying at least 2% more just to get credit. It's crazy, right? We have small shares of SDRs. We've spoken about that quite a bit, and there's going to be some sessions this afternoon. There's unpreparedness for climate issues, and Africa takes the brunt of this, although we don't contribute much to it. There's volatile markets, and again, we just sort of affected. We need tax architecture change. We need new tax conventions. We need a way of asset recoveries. We also talk about, you know, mechanisms for these credit rating agencies. There's all these things we need. And so these are all the changes we need for step one. So to your question, Janai, this is step one in the process. When we get our money, we need to start building on that. We need to start continuing our revenue mobilization. We need to start having efficient fiscal structures and making sure that we manage our money properly. Yeah, and I just, my last point, I want to pick up again on a little bit on our, how we look at things. We are, you know, if you do surveys, I used to work at Statistics South Africa, and the income expenditure survey is a retrospective survey, so you have to say how much money you spent in the previous 11 years. And when you, and when you do that, you forget some things. And we really need to think about what is important for us for the future. So not forgetting the past, but also thinking about the future. Interesting thing for me is, why are we not talking about how a possibility of a debt crisis could affect, in the European Union, could affect Africa? What do you think is going to happen with the funding if there's a crisis there? It's just a little food for thought. But thank you so much for having me on the panel. Thanks.
All right, a round of applause. Okay, so we have looked at the topic that Theo set for us, you know, through different lenses. We've heard the perspectives from our honorable from Zambia, as well as the honorable from Ghana, and then also heard some views, you know, from the East African community, and then delved into some of the solutions, right, which look like increased domestic resource mobilization, as well as reform of the international financial architecture. So I'm now going to open it up for questions towards any of the panelists, as well as Theo, with regards to any points that was raised earlier. As we do so, can I just get from AfCODD an indication of what time we need to wrap up, because we did start a bit late. Sorry? 20? Oh, in 20 minutes. Okay, all right. Okay, so we can take a couple. So I can see there's a hand here. I don't know if there's a roving mic to help with the questions. Okay, great. So there's 2 hands on the same table. Any other hands? Any other questions? Okay, great. And then I can see a question there. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I wonder why you keep asking for questions. Mine is not a question, but I wish to bring some comments and maybe a few recommendations.
Could you bring your mic a bit closer?
Yes. So thank you very much, Theo, for the presentation, and thank the other panelists for their reactions. I think we should bring this conversation to what we heard yesterday, and then maybe try to find solutions. So the picture that Theo painted is really dreadful, and we need to do something about that. But that something, in my view, is not just reforming the international financial architecture. I think it's about sweeping our house, as our brother from the African Union said yesterday. How do we sweep this house? The way to sweep the house is, first of all, to understand that some of the criteria that we have don't fit the situation. When you take the convergent criteria, many of our leaders, when you get to bring some ideas on the situation on debt in Africa, they will tell you, look, our country is still not at the level of the criteria. That is, maybe the criteria in CEMAC, for instance, is 70%, and then they will tell you, we are still at 41%, so we are okay. And then we end up having the country in debt distress. So I think we need to come back and see how we manage our debt. I will bring the health picture. We need to look at how we do the hygiene first before we cure. Doing the hygiene means that we need to have a real debt management system that looks toward development. Not just, the MP was saying it for Zambia, it's not just about borrowing and borrowing. Let us borrow for specific purposes, and that purpose should serve development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, on the same table.
Thank you. Abraham here from Kenya. I think my question is to the 2 parliamentarians, because a lot of the discussion that we have had since yesterday seems to rotate to the people who hold the representative power and oversight role in these countries, in our countries. And a lot of these debts have been procured either with the watch or away from the watch of Parliament. But what we don't get a sense, and I'm not hearing that a lot, on the things James has just talked about. Where do you see the role of Parliament, not just in celebrating that we have gotten ourselves out of a debt crisis of sorts, as is the case in Zambia, but more on pushing this accountability question? Because that's a question that we get swept under, and sometimes even parliamentarians almost speak like the rest of us who have no role, who have no power, yet they have that